All right, so we are in Judges chapters 6, 7, and 8. We're looking at the story of Gideon. And before I read the very start of it, what do you know about Gideon? Just shout it out.
He's a judge.
He's a judge. Well done. Way to use context clues. He is famously associated with the skin or the wool of what animal? A sheep, a fleece.
No fleecing.
No fleecing. No fleecing in trades. Fleecing in judges, not in fantasy football trades. Okay.
Had his army whittled down to 300 and fought some people.
Had his army whittled down to 300 and fought some people. We've given a very good picture of Gideon. All right, so we're going to get into all of those things. So we're going to start with Judges 6, 1 to 10, and I'll actually read these verses. The people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian 7 years. Actually, pause before I read. Can somebody quickly look up Genesis 3:11?
Gotcha.
Tim. And can somebody look up Ezekiel 3:17 to 19, please? Dawson, thank you. All right, Judges 6, verse 1. The people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian 7 years. And the hand of Midian overpowered Israel. And because of Midian, the people of Israel made for themselves the dens that are in the mountains and the caves and the strongholds. For whenever the Israelites planted crops, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east would come up against them. They would encamp against them and devour the produce of the land as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel, and no sheep or ox or donkey. For they would come up with their livestock and their tents. They would come like locusts in number. Both they and their camels could not be counted, so that they laid waste the land as they came in. And Israel was brought very low because of Midian, and the people of Israel cried out for help to the Lord. When the people of Israel cried out to the Lord on account of the Midianites, the Lord sent a prophet to the people of Israel. And he said to them, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I led you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of slavery. And I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of all who oppressed you, and drove them out before you and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell, but you have not obeyed my voice." What specific detail did you guys see in those 10 verses that we haven't yet seen in the story of Jephthah, Ehud, or Deborah and Barak? Anybody catch it? All right, let's do a refresher. What pattern did we see? We established this as the pattern for Ehud, Deborah and Barak, and Jephthah. What happens first? The people sin, they do evil on the side of the Lord. They sin, then they call for help, and then God sends a deliverer. What step is added in Judges 6, 1 to 10? What does God do that he has not yet done?
He sends a prophet.
He sends a prophet. And the prophet does what? Thus says the Lord. And he reminds them, check out verses 7 to 10. What's he say? He says, look, God told you not to do this. God told you what would happen if you do this. He says, I led you up from Egypt. I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians. I delivered from the hand of all who oppressed you. I gave you their land. I told you, don't fear the gods of the Amorites, but you have not obeyed my voice. God reminds the people, I established this, and you've sinned and disobeyed. Tim, could you read Genesis 3:11, please?
He said, of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?
Dawson, could you read Ezekiel 3:17-19, please?
Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. Whenever you hear a word from my mouth, you shall give them warning from me. If I say to the wicked, you shall surely die, and you give him no warning, nor speak to warn the wicked from his wicked way in order to save his life, that wicked person shall die for his iniquity, but his blood I will require at your hand. But if you warn the wicked, and he does not turn from his wickedness or from his wicked way, he shall die for his iniquity, but you will have delivered your soul.
What theme do you guys note? Remember, we want to be training ourselves and studying, right? So if scripture is about God's glory, what theme do you see in Judges 6:7-10? What theme do you see in Genesis 3:11? What theme do you see in Ezekiel 3:17-19 about the Lord?
He tells us what he wants.
He tells us, that wasn't like a trick question. He tells us what he wants. He gives warning. He lays out the expectations. One of the attacks levied against God that drives me so nuts is when people are like, well, God's not fair. How is that fair? And it's like, what do you mean God's not fair? God says, hey, if A, then B. And when the people do A, B happens. Like, what does God say to Adam and Eve? Did you eat of the one thing I told you not to do? Did you do it? What's he saying to Ezekiel? I sent you a warning. I gave you a heads up. I raised the alarm. What's he say in Judges 6? He says, I told you not to do this. I told you if you did this, there would be consequences. And so I think we have to be able to be ready to biblically defend this just absolute bogus notion that God is somehow not fair to people. He gives warnings every time. He lays out, like Tim said, this is what you need to do. And it goes back to the sermon we looked at 2 weeks ago, where blame ultimately winds up in blaming God. And we need to be able to say, no, you know what? God told me not to eat of that tree. God told me the enemy was coming over the hill, and I ignored the warning. God told me not to go after the idols, and I did it anyway. I think Judges 6, we said this back in week 1 and in week 2. I don't think Judges is a depressing book. I think Judges is one of the most encouraging books for how it points to just so many wonderful attributes of God. The first one being, he's fair. He gives us the warning. He lays out the rules. And then if we break them, we can't pretend like we did so out of ignorance. Any questions, any thoughts on the first 10 verses? The next section, I'll give a quick recap. Okay, Judges 6, 11-27. You have the angel of the Lord goes to Gideon, and he says, hey, the Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor, O mighty warrior, O mighty one. So rise and lead the people. And Gideon says, no, it can't be me. And the angel of the Lord again says, no, I'm telling you, this is the call on your life. Do it. And Gideon again says, no, it can't be me. And the angel again says, no, I'm telling you, this is the call on your life. And Gideon says, okay, well, if it's you, then consume this offering, right? Like, let me see a sign to prove it. And the angel does it. And Gideon's like, oh, no, I really messed up. And he falls on his face. And the angel says, fear not, you're not going to die, right? So we already have this where God's like, hey, do this. Nope, do this. Nope, do this. Prove it. Oh, shoot, you proved it. Surely Gideon gets it right after that. No, go past verse 27, jump ahead to verse 36-40. God gives Gideon a new set of commands, and Gideon goes, well, let's just do a real quick test with a fleece and some dew. God, okay, does the test. Gideon says, all right, well, good enough. No. Gideon goes, okay, that second test was great, but let me do even one more third test to really confirm that this is you and this is what you're telling me to do. And God again does it. God is, and the reason we're not spending a whole lot of time on this is because spoilers for the sermon on Sunday, and so I don't want to get into the whole sermon on Sunday. Could somebody look up Exodus 34:6, please? Not named Tim or Dawson. Cool, thank you. God is so unbelievably patient with the people of Israel throughout the book of Exodus, but it's not just macro. God is so unbelievably patient with Gideon throughout these chapters. Like, Gideon is so resistant and hesitant to obey. And every time he asks for, prove it, God just does. Like, the patience is mind-blowing to me. Exodus 34:6, if you're there.
The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness.
Slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, merciful and gracious. Like, even if nothing else in the story of Gideon stands out to you, please note how wonderfully enduring, patient God is with Gideon. It's really incredible. And so now take a moment, all of us read verse 13, read verse 15, and read verse 27. So just read those 3 verses and then, kind of look up when you're done. Of chapter 6. Uh, 13, 15, and 27. All right, somebody summarize, why did Gideon express doubt and uncertainty in verse 13?
Because God had seemed absent.
God had seemed absent in the circumstances that the whole nation was going through, right? Gideon starts off very macro. God, you seem absent in the events happening to our entire people group. Summarize verse 15. What reason does Gideon give for hesitancy and doubt in verse 15?
He's the weakest group.
Weakest. Now he goes personal, right? Now he goes micro. I'm the weakest from the weakest from the weakest. I'm the runt of the litter. Summarize, what is he afraid of? What causes him to change his actions in verse 27? His own family. The reaction of his family and friends. He was afraid of the people in his life and how they might respond to what he was doing. What happens in our own life that causes us to doubt or question or shrink back from God's call on our lives? Security. Boom. I mean, I think you see Gideon express, hey, it seems like there's a lack of security for our people group, right? Our nation, the nation of Israel, is experiencing a lack of security. So I'm going to question God. Hey, I'm questioning my own personal security if I step out in obedience. How are my friends and family going to react? I think a fear or a fear of a lack of security is a huge reason why we question God's call in our lives. Feeling inadequate. I'm the littlest guy in the littlest family in the littlest tribe, right? Like, no, you don't want me to do it. You have no idea how ill prepared I am to actually handle this. Scared of what others will think of us. I was going to share the gospel with my coworkers, but I didn't want to be that guy. I was going to suggest we do this, but I didn't want to be, that weirdo in the family. Right? Like, well, I think God's calling me into ministry, but what are my parents going to say? What's my wife going to say? What are my kids going to say? Scared of what people will think of us? Absolutely. We give so much weight to people's opinions.
Sacrifice your own desires.
Sacrifice your own desires, not named by Gideon, but a great reason why we're tempted to doubt or resist or shrink back from God's call. Well, this is what I want to do, and the call might get in the way of that. Yeah, absolutely.
I think a doubt of, is this really God?
Ooh, yeah.
He kind of has that when he's questioning how the nation of Israel, the situation that they're in,
Is this really from God? Yeah, that was a very personal one for me. When I first started feeling called into ministry, it was coinciding with a time where I was really, really dissatisfied with my job. And I was really sick of my job and fed up with my job. And at first, I think I was reluctant to recognize it as a call from the Lord, because when I would talk to some of my friends about it, including like good, godly Christian people, right? But a lot of the feedback is like, well, is it possible you're just burnt out at work, right? So you're looking for anything that will get you out of this job, Yeah, that's a great one. Man, you guys have had some good ones. I think all of these. And so keep those in the back of your mind as we continue to progress through the story of Gideon. But again, don't lose sight of the fact the more important thing is God's patience, right? God's patience. And he doesn't pull the call back from Gideon's life. He continues to patiently call him, which is beautiful and wonderful. All right, so now we are going to read again. So this is Judges 6:28 to 32. So we've got, hey, the Lord reminds the people, this is pretty fair. I told you what would happen. They did anyway. So now he raises up a judge. The judge resists, the judge resists, the judge resists. And then he finally takes part in it. And so first I'm going to read verse 25. That night the Lord said to him, take your father's bull and the second bull, 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the Asherah that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on top of the stronghold here. So God says, as your first act as judge, go kill the idols. Go tear down the idols, go tear down the statues, go tear down the false altars, raise a real altar, right? When the men of town, verse 28 now, when the men of the town rose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was broken down, and the Asherah beside it was cut down, and the second bull was offered on the altar that had been built. And they said to one another, who has done this thing? And after they had searched and inquired, they said, Gideon, the son of Joash, has done this thing. Then the men of the town said to Joash, bring out your son that he may die, for he has broken down the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah beside it. But Joash said to all who stood against him, will you contend for Baal, or will you save him? Whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because his altar has been broken down. Therefore, on that day, Gideon was called Jerubbaal, that is to say, let Baal contend against him, because he broke down his altar. We will not read 1 Samuel 5, and we won't read 1 Kings 18, 17 to 40. I highly recommend that you do. I'm going to read Psalm 115, 4 to 8. Could somebody look up Habakkuk 2, 18 to 20, please? Steve, thank you. Habakkuk 2, 18 to 20. Could somebody look up, this is admittedly a longer one. Okay, would somebody rather read Psalm 115, 4 to 8? And I'll do 21 to 29. Would somebody rather do 4 verses and I'll do the 8 verses?
Okay.
All right, Aaron, can you do Psalm 115, 4 to 8, please? And I'll look up the Isaiah one. Steve, whenever you've got your Habakkuk, go ahead and read it for us.
What profit is the idol when its maker has carved it, or an image, a teacher of falsehood? For its maker trusts in his own handiwork when he fashions speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a piece of wood, awake, to mute a stone, arise, and this is your teacher. Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all inside of it. But the Lord is in the holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him.
Aaron, if you could read Psalm 115, please.
The idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths but do not speak, eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear, noses but do not smell. They have hands but do not feel, feet but do not walk. And they do not make a sound in their throat. Those who make them become like them. So do all who trust in them.
And then Isaiah 41, starting in verse 21. Set forth your case, says the Lord. Bring your proof, says the King of Jacob. Let them bring them and tell us what is to happen. Tell us the former things, what they are, that we may consider them, that we may know their outcome, or declare to us the things to come. Tell us what is to come hereafter, that we may know you are gods. Do good and do harm, that we may be dismayed and terrified. So God is addressing idols in this section. He says, tell us what is to come afterward, that we may know that you are gods. Behold, you are nothing, and your work is less than nothing. An abomination is he who chooses you. I stirred up one from the north, and he has come, from the rising of the sun, and he shall call upon my name. He shall trample on rulers as on mortar, and as the potter treads clay. Who declared it from the beginning that we might know, and beforehand that we might say he is right. There was none who declared it, none who proclaimed, none who heard your words. I was the first to say to Zion, behold, here they are, and I give to Jerusalem a herald of good news. But when I look, there is no one. Among these there is no counselor who, when I ask, gives an answer. Behold, they are all a delusion, their works are nothing, their metal images are empty wind. What do we see about God and the people's response to their altar to Baal being torn down and their Asherah pole being torn down? And Joash's response, rather than just their immediate conversation, what do we see about God?
There should be no other gods before him.
There is no other God. Gene's right. There is no other God. We didn't read 1 Samuel 5. Again, those chapters on there on your sheet, some of the chapters, some of the other sections we didn't read, highly recommend you read those. 1 Samuel 5 is when the Ark of the Covenant is stolen by the Philistines and they put it next to their God. And the next morning they wake up and their God statue has fallen over. So they pick him back up and the next morning he's fallen over. And this time the head's broken off and the torso's broken in two. And they're like, oh shoot, we should get rid of it. 1 Kings 18, 17-40 has the single funniest line in all of Scripture. When Elijah says, maybe your God's on the toilet. That is when he says, maybe your God is occupied. The original language was, maybe your God's pooping. And that's why he's not answering you, which is hysterical that Elijah gets that bluntly in the face of the prophets of Baal. I think Gene hit it well.
It reminds me of when I was researching for the bread of the presence. One of the things that was so unique about it was that someone actually came in and ate it, because the other religions at the time believed that their god needed to eat, and so they would put out stuff because their god was probably angry with them because he was hungry, and just the irony of that and the humanization of that. Our God needs to eat because he's probably angry with us because we haven't fed him in a while.
Hey, Dagon, have a Snickers. You're not you when you're hungry. I love Joash's response. Whoa. If Baal's God, let him contend for himself. Right? If he's this super powerful deity, don't you think he's got something to say about his altar being torn down? And the other reason I picked, did you know the second half of Isaiah 41? Did you note what appeared in Psalm 115? Did you note what appeared in Habakkuk a little bit as well? Not only do you have God laying out how stupid idols are, what does he also point out about himself? Let me reread Isaiah 41:25. I stirred up one from the north, and he has come, From the rising of the sun, he shall call upon my name. He shall trample on the rulers as on mortar, as the potter treads clay.
That he is the greatest.
That he's the greatest.
That he is in control of everything. And your idols, is just plain shameful.
He's going to stomp on them, right?
The other idols are worthless because they're wood, metal, or whatever. I mean, they're dead. You know, he's alive. So.
Yeah, dude.
Proves that.
I love that he points out they're mute. They can't think. They can't see. They can't hear. Like, everything is a contrast to, I am the living God. Your idols will not contend for themselves. I will contend for myself. It is an incredible picture in Gideon of the supremacy of the Lord as the only God. And I love the contrast between the mute, worthless altar to Baal and the power of the Lord to contend for his people. What was part of Gideon's fear in verse 27? Go back to the question that we just talked about with the previous passage. Verse 27, what was part of Gideon's fear? His family. Right? He said, I've got to do it at night because I'm worried about how my family will respond if I tear down the altars. Who's his dad? Joash. Who responds to protect him from the angry mob in verse 31? So did Gideon make an accurate assumption about his family's response? No. Remember the Exodus sermon from January 14th, if you can cast your minds back to January 14th. Steve just looked at me like I'm insane. On the 14th, we looked at Pharaoh issuing the edict to kill the Israelites. And do you remember we described it as a very unhealthy spiral into what if, right? I mean, Pharaoh says, okay, what if the Israelites keep having babies? And what if they get too big? And what if an enemy comes and attacks us? And what if the Israelites fight with them? Like, Pharaoh spiraled into this just cynical, pessimistic, evil assumption. Gideon here is like, oh, I've got to operate at night in secrecy because what's my family going to do to me if they see me doing this? What's his family do? His dad's got his back. Can anyone think of a time, and if you don't want to share it, I get it, because these can be embarrassing. I can think of, I'll share a story that illustrates like the fearful assumption. But think of a time, I mean, have there been times in your life where you've seen the futility of making negative assumptions, right? We build a situation up. Oh man, my boss is calling me in to fire me. Like, for me, I came from a job I did not have a healthy workplace, right? Had a very unhealthy relationship with my boss. So I was used to, if my boss said, hey, come see me, I was going to get yelled at for something dumb that I didn't do. I start my new job with healthy leadership who are Christian and lead in a Christian way, and I get a text from my boss, hey, come to my office. Like, my partner and I, my business partner, we need to talk to you. And I'm walking down there, and I walk in, and they're like, you know, you've been here 6 months, you're killing it, we want to give you a raise. And I went, oh yeah? Wait now, what? Right? And I realized, like, I could feel, and when I left, they were like, yeah, you've been doing great. And I left, and I was like, man, why does my jaw hurt? Like, why do my palms hurt? And I realized that I had been walking down there, clenching my jaw, like, making fists with my hands, assuming this is going to be a negative, bad interaction. This is not going to be positive. And it was great. And then I felt like an idiot, right? But the sad thing is, we tend to do that. We tend to make negative assumptions about, and I think it goes back to what's one of the reasons we can resist God's call on our lives? Because we're afraid of how people are going to react, right? Well, if I ask the random guy at the recycling center, hey, which, by the way, if you're at the recycling center, the dude with the massive dreadlocks, his name is Josh. He's always wearing a superhero t-shirt. Really nice. Had great conversations with him. So if you see him, his name's Josh, and you can freak him out. But, right, like, what if I ask him, hey, how can I pray for you? And he like flips me off or something and like throws my recycling back in my car. So I'll just shrink back from trying to engage with him. Like, we have to guard against making unhealthy, fearful assumptions about how people might respond and allow that to dictate our actions. And so to bring it back to the Lord and to bring it back to some of the previous points, all right, so looking at Judges 6, 11 to 27 and 36 to 40, we see just the patience of God over and over again. Looking at Judges 6, 28 to 32 and all those other verses in the Old Testament, we see that God is the only true living God who will contend for himself, who alone has power to contend for himself. So in light of how we see this point to God, in light of Gideon's worrying about his family's response for nothing, what should our attitude be when God calls us to do something? And if you want a hint, check out one of my absolute favorite verses, Isaiah 41:10.
Lord, send me.
Lord, send me. Great response.
We should thank him for the opportunity to do it.
Thank him for the opportunity to do it instead of worrying about how wrong it might go. Say, cool, I've got an opportunity to obey and to serve you. Thank you.
Paul's response for me to live is Christ, to die is gain.
To live is Christ, to die is gain. Yeah.
I think the one that's most relevant to me is Mark, the dad of the boy with the unholy spirit says, I believe, help my unbelief.
I believe, help my unbelief, recognizing that we need to grow. Great response to when God calls us to something.
Going off your Isaiah 41:10, I mean, responding with confidence, knowing that it's God who goes before us and God who is with us, and it's Him that's doing the work. It's not on our shoulders. You know?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you don't get me wrong. You guys all gave phenomenal responses, and I actually like some of your responses. I think better than my own. But yeah, for me, the verse I always go to is, "Fear not, for I am with you. Do not be afraid. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. Like, I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my mighty right hand." These idols, they don't have hands. They've got images of hands, but those hands can't make a fist. Those hands can't hurl a thunderbolt. Those hands can't shape a mountain, right? Like, it's all of the above. It's okay, to live is Christ, to die is gain. God's with me. I'm grateful for the opportunity to serve. Lord, I believe, and where I'm weak, help me so that I can go do this and fight. I really love what you see about the Lord's character and how it strengthens us for his call on our lives.
I think we need to realize too that looking at Gideon especially, he had a very small view of God. And for us to get caught up in a spiral of what ifs is not necessarily just self-doubt, but it's a small view of God. Because to say, well, God, don't you know that I'm the smallest from the smallest from the smallest, is really to say that I don't think you can do it. You know, we might not frame it that way, because no Christian wants to say, I don't think God can do it. But at the end of the line of our doubt, that's what it's actually coming from, is I don't think God can do it, and I don't want to submit in case he does. You know?
Here's another one, Steve. You can look at me like I'm insane. Does anyone remember the question I closed the sermon with on January 21st?
Oh, of course.
We were talking about Moses and God's call on Moses' life, right? And Moses gives God, I'm not good at public speaking. And God says, who do you think made your mouth? And I just asked the question, whatever excuse you're tempted to fire off at God, do you think he doesn't know that? Right?
Yeah, you may be, but you actually know it.
Yeah, right? Look, I know you know everything, but you do know that I have a fear of public speaking, right? We have to have that right view of the Lord. And when we have a right view of the Lord, I believe our response to the Lord will follow suit. Okay, so then you've got Judges 7. This is What Tim said stands out about Gideon, what he knows about Gideon. God keeps whittling down the army. He starts off with tons of guys, plenty big enough army to go fight the Midianites, and God says, too many. Let's cut that down to size. And so they do, and then God says, yeah, still too many. Let's cut that down to size again. And so then he's going into battle with 300 against thousands and thousands. Take a moment, read Judges 7, verse 2. We're not going to read all of Judges 7, but in Judges chapter 7, it's God whittling down Gideon's army, and then Gideon and the army going out and kicking the snot out of the Midianites. All right. Could somebody look up Psalm 27, please? Not like Psalm 27, but Psalm 20, verse 7.
I can.
Sweet. And can somebody look up Isaiah 42, 8, please?
I got it.
Cool. Thank you. Okay, so while they're looking those up, what was Kyle's concluding point? Where did his Bible study culminate with last week? It had to do with Ehud being left-handed.
Using unlikely people.
Using unlikely people. Being left-handed was thought of as a weakness, handicap. Anybody know 2 Corinthians 12:9 off the top of their head?
Is it they'll use the weak to shame the wise?
Not that one. It's right after Paul talking about his thorn.
Strength is made perfect in weakness.
His strength is made perfect in weakness. Who's got Psalm 27?
I think in 1 Corinthians 1.
Oh, me.
Oh, yeah, Psalm 20, verse 7.
I distracted.
You said verse 7?
Yes, please.
Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God.
And Isaiah 42, 8.
I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to carved idols.
Some trust in chariots, some trust in armor. We trust in the Lord. What does the Lord say about himself in Isaiah 42? I am God. I don't share my glory with anybody. I love Judges 7, verse 2. What stands out to you guys about that verse? Thinking of the Lord and who he is and our response to him.
So then Tim talking about, there's too many people and then Israel start boasting. It kind of reminds me of like the rich man. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than the rich man into the gates because it's his wealth. It's his this. They wasn't given to him by God, Just where the boasting can come in.
Paul rebukes the whole church in Corinth. He says, what do you have that you did not receive? Why then do you boast as if you did not receive it?
It's that security question that somebody talked about. We want to have the numbers on our side because then we feel secure. But then we don't give God the credit because we got the numbers on our side. Well, we had the numbers on our side,
Dude.
That's why you guys beat the youth. You have the age numbers on your side.
We've got experience, baby.
Experience.
That's why God took Tim off of our team so that we would know.
Oh, way to tie it back to a former question. Yeah. Proverbs 38:9 is where he says, give me neither too much nor too little. And the reason he lists for I don't want to be given too much is lest I boast and I forget you, Lord.
It reminds me of the apostles on the road, discussing who is the greatest. And what's really interesting about that is right before that, Christ had taken them aside and he had reminded them that they're on the road to Jerusalem where he's going to die for the sins of the world. And the irony of them thinking that they're out here being such good followers of Christ and therefore they're great people and they're striving for that greatness to kind of one-up each other. And I mean, like God says here, it's lest they think they've done it themselves, you know.
I heard and it might be a famous pastor, and whoever I heard was quoting him, but a pastor at one point in a sermon said, God will always do that which brings glory to his name. And if that means cutting the army down to size so that you look like a bunch of fools heading off to fight, right? Like, I mean, what? The Midianite army was, does it actually list the full numbers? It just says they would come like locusts in numbers. And so locusts were used in the Bible to describe, you can't even count them, right? Like here is a swarm of locusts that devours the whole land. And so the Midianites are like locusts in numbers. And here you've got 300 guys going to fight them. There is no way the outcome can do anything but bring glory to God. And that's what God is going to do. And so what does that remind you? Like go beyond, or it reminds me that everything's about God's glory, right? But what does that tell us about God's purposes? What does that tell us about our response to the Lord?
I think it should teach us humble adoration, that God is so perfectly sovereign that he even chooses paths that we would never even consider, because in us not considering them, he would be more fully glorified, you know.
My ways are not your ways. My thoughts are not your thoughts. Yeah. There's got to be a humility of, okay.
He may reduce our physical resources to demonstrate his. And
Good. All right. So you went in one of the directions I want to go. Okay. So piggyback off of Gene's. Physical resources are dwindling. Things are getting smaller. Things are getting leaner. Things are getting scarcer. How are we inclined to respond? We tend to assume that when things shrink, what?
that we're not,
It's going to die.
we're not going to be able to handle.
That we're not going to be able to handle what's coming up next. That it's God's judgment, right?
Yes.
Well, that's why things are shrinking, because God's displeased with us. Like we make these assumptions that are, again, go back to what did Gideon do to his family? Negative assumptions, right? We tend to view what's healthy and holy in a very specific way. And if it doesn't fit our thought of what should be happening, clearly things are about to get really bad. And so I think frequently we just need to reflect that humility. We need to reflect that patience. We need to reflect that confidence of, okay, it might not make sense to me, but I know who you are, Lord. And so I'm in, right?
So often we're not patient enough to allow the Lord to do that.
Yeah.
It's a virtue.
It's a virtue.
I don't possess it. And God, you say God's going to do what brings him glory, and our response should be the same.
Ooh.
We want to do what brings God glory. We don't want, our tendency is to want to claim, stuff for ourselves.
Yep.
Get the glory for ourselves, build ourselves up or whatever. But our response needs to be what's going to bring God's glory.
Mm-hmm.
I like to think of like the 300 men and the faithfulness that they had, because I don't know, for me, if there's only 300 men and there's an army bigger than the size of locusts, I can't even count. Like, am I ready to just charge in there? Like, I'm still a little bit fearful of it.
Yeah.
They did.
I mean, they started with over 30,000, right? Like, so we are talking 1%. Like, that is definitely from a human perspective, if I place myself in their shoes, I think it'd be like, okay, we've got 30,000 of us. That's not so. Hey, why are 2/3 of the people leaving? Okay, we still have 10,000 of us. That's not so. Hey, why are they leaving? Like, You know what? I forgot my sword at home, Gideon. Let me run back real quick. I'll catch up with you guys. See you there, right? Yeah, the faithfulness of the men to stay and to fight.
Yeah, I think just thinking about the not trying to claim any glory for ourselves and all the different ways that we try to sneak it in there of like, whether it's labeling something a coincidence because then we come out looking better because we reacted correctly, or like, you know what, I had bad odds there, but I pulled through all the different ways societally that we attempt to sap that glory away from the sovereignty of God, and just how, I mean, think about, he removes 97% of the men, like 97%, so that he will be the most glorified from this situation. Like, that's how much he has to take away before we will finally go, okay, it is you, you know? Like, if it had been less, he could have stopped.
No, even more. He removes 22,000, then 10,000, and leaves 300.
Yeah,
So 99%. Right? Or am I that bad at math?
Started with 30 or
30, so 22 go home, and there's 10,300 left, and 10,000 go home. So there's 32,300 to begin with.
no, there's just 32,000.
Yeah, just 32, because 22,000 go home, 10,000 remain, and then 300 of those 10,000 remain.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that makes sense. That's why you round over number. So 32,000. So yeah, 300 of 32,000, 10% would be 3,200. Yeah, so you're looking about 1%. That's crazy. It is. It's crazy that you're probably like, that's what it takes for us to realize this. I like to think in my ego that I'd pick up on it somewhere around 50%, but in reality, it's like, no. We need to get to like a 99%. Like, you need the full stop. That's a good point.
When I read these stories, I know people say it all the time, that we like to make fun of Gideon and say, man, you ask God to do all these things, but he's sitting there saying, don't get angry with me for asking again, and then the 99% have to disappear for that 1% to recognize God did it. But how often in our own lives do we sit there and say, well, Lord, if you show me, if you make this evidently clearly, do this, and I don't believe it.
Yep.
And then even then, we still doubt it.
Yeah. I love the word you use, right? We try to explain it away as a coincidence. One of my favorite videos of all time, and I think I've showed a number of you guys this, it's a guy, he was, I don't know, like a YouTube atheist or whatever, right? He built his following as an atheist, and he's driving in the car during a thunderstorm one time, and he's going on a rant about coincidences. And he's like, the statistical probability, and people want to explain it as God, and he's like, there is no God. If there's a God, there would be a massive lightning strike in 3, 2, 1, and the whole thing lights up. And he freezes on camera and he goes, well, this is concerning. And then he just ends the video, right? Like, and that's, we want to explain it away as a coincidence. We're like, okay, Lord, if it's really from you, send somebody with a red shirt through the door. Somebody with a red shirt comes in and like, I mean, red's a pretty common color. The odds were probably good that I'm in Target. It was probably going to be an employee. Yeah.
Now, to get down to 300 and all these thousands coming after you, that would take a lot of faith in the Lord.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You would have to be faithful with the Lord is going to be there for you.
I have to say, I respect the humility of the 300, though. Nothing was ever said about it being done.
No. Especially, they go out with trumpets and jars. Like, if I'm going out against a horde of locusts with only 300 of us, I'm strapping every piece of available weaponry to my body. And instead, Gideon's like, okay, here's your trumpet and here's your clay jar. That's when I'm definitely like, you know what? I actually do drink water the other way. I shouldn't be here. All right, chapter 8. So this is kind of the aftermath. And here's what I want to encourage you guys. We're not going to read through again. We're not going to read through all of chapter 8. We're not going to even read all these verses. But don't ever stop short in Scripture, right? Don't ever don't ever say, I'm pretty sure this is the finish line in Scripture. Because if you look at Gideon, what's the big story? I mean, what did all of us recollect about Gideon? The fleece, the army getting whittled down, the big fight against the Midianites. We tend to think that that's the entirety of Gideon's story. But Gideon's story continues through chapter 8. And so in chapter 8, 1-3, the men of Ephraim, another part of Israel, they come to him and they're all ticked off. They're like, hey, why didn't you do this? You wronged us, da-da-da. Like, they're riled up and they're ready for a hassle. They're ready for a problem to develop. And Gideon, it says, and they accused him fiercely. And he said to them, what have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the grape harvest of Abiezer? God has given into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb, and Zeb. What have I been able to do in comparison with you? Then their anger against him subsided when he said this. Anybody know Proverbs 15, 1-2 off the top of their head? What does a gentle answer do? Turns away wrath. These people come to Gideon. They're all ticked off. They're all hacked off. They accuse him fiercely. And Gideon just calmly responds. And their anger subsides and the problem goes away. A gentle answer turns away wrath. Are we training ourselves to respond gently in volatile situations? Chapter 8, verses 4-21, a big section. Gideon, they're chasing after some of the remaining enemy. They come to people who should be friendly to them, and they're like, hey, we're exhausted, we're tired, can you give us some bread? And the people make fun of them. They're like, well, you haven't won anything yet, why should we help you, right? They're kind of playing the odds. So Gideon's like, okay, well, we're going to go deal with the enemy. And then when they deal with the enemy, they come back, and they're like, hey, remember when you wouldn't help us? You wouldn't help God's people in their time of need? Now you suffer the consequences of it. And then they get dealt with very harshly. Anybody know Galatians 6:7 off the top of their head?
God will not be mocked.
God will not be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. They mock God's people. They mock God's army. They mock God's leader. And they reap the destruction that comes from that. Don't miss these details in chapter 8. And then I do want to read chapter 8, 22-27, because this is the part of Gideon's story that I've gotten asked about most frequently. Because it's in there, and it kind of, you shake your head or you scratch your head a little bit at first. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian. Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. That's a pretty good answer, right? Okay, Gideon's on track. Cool, good job. And Gideon said to them, let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil, for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered, we will willingly give them. And they spread a cloak, and every man threw in it the earrings of his spoil. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, and besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels. And Gideon made an ephod of it and put it in his city in Ophrah. And all Israel whored after it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. Well, wait a minute. What happened to the Gideon who said, no, I'm not going to rule over you. God rules over you. Now he's making an ephod, and that's a huge deal? What in the world's an ephod?
Something on the priestly robe or something, right?
Yeah, my man Tim! We looked at it in Exodus chapter 28, and we'll see it again pop up in a few weeks in Exodus 39. An ephod was an integral part of the high priestly garments, and it symbolized the right to speak to the Lord and to hear from the Lord. It was used for judgment. If you read 1 Samuel 23, 9-12, and 1 Samuel 30, 7-8, you see that when David wants to consult with the Lord, he has to call the priest to him wearing the ephod. And that's the consultation with the Lord that happens. So there was only to be one ephod for the people of Israel that the priest wore to consult with God on behalf of the people. Gideon had no right to make an ephod for himself and for his own family. And he went and did so anyway. And what happens? All of Israel whores after it, and it's his destruction. Like, what does this go back to? Do you remember your verse that you read in Isaiah 42:8?
God won't give his glory to anyone else.
God won't give his glory to anyone else. Gideon's like, no, God's ruler. but I'm going to elevate myself to the position of consulting with God. So let's go ahead and make an ephod. And it destroys things. Like, don't think that Gideon's story ends in chapter 7. Don't sell ourselves short as we're reading through scripture. Make sure we're faithful and we stick through to the end. I love the quick hits in Judges 8 because they remind us that the Lord's way is what leads to righteousness, right? A gentle answer turns away wrath. How does Jesus describe his heart? Gentle and lowly. So a gentle answer does what? It reflects Jesus' heart. And that's what turns away wrath. 8:4-21. Don't be deceived. A man reaps what he sows. Why? Because God will not be mocked. 8:22-27. Don't be deceived. A man reaps what he sows. Why? Because God will not be mocked, and his glory he will not share with another. The entirety of Gideon's story should remind us overwhelmingly that God will always do what gives him glory, and like Tim said, we must therefore always do the same. And when we do the same, the battle is won. When we don't do the same, the destruction happens.
I mean, it's the exact same thing as Jephthah. The one thing we try to add to it, and Jephthah ends up getting his daughter killed. And then same here, it's the destruction of Gideon and his family. It's like, you think they'd be able to see it, but it's just human nature. But everything we try to add that's away from God is the thing that leads to death and destruction.
Dude, well done tying it back to Jephthah. Absolutely. Everything we try and add.
Jacob.
He's not even here to defend
Not even here to defend himself. Any other thoughts on Gideon?
Gideon, I think it reminds you that it doesn't matter your excuses that are weak, settled, whatever you think you are, God doesn't see you the way you view yourself. And I think that's the thing you need to take away as far as you can give all the excuses, that's not what he sees.
There's an old, and by old I mean like the 90s, so my apologies.
Nice guy.
The good years.
The good years.
Yeah, the good years.
The good
Back when
years.
the Cowboys actually won something? Yeah.
There is it an Audio Adrenaline song I think called My Worldview, and it says, "I want to see the world through Jesus' eyes. My vision's not as clear." Right? I think it's on the same album as Big House, which is a great, fun song, but totally unrelated to Gideon. But yeah, we want the perspective of the Lord, and the perspective of the Lord is what will bring me glory. And our response in that is submission and surrender so that God can receive the glory that he is rightfully due, so that we can't boast in ourselves. Or, like Walker pointed out, so that we don't make the mistake of trying to add something, and then the one ingredient we add is what blows it up. It'd be like if we walked into like a 3-star Michelin restaurant, and the chef brings out his best dish, and you're like, yeah, but I'm going to go real head quick and just add, a little bit of Frank's Red Hot to this. Like, the chef knows what he's doing. God knows what he's doing. He shows it with Gideon. He proves himself patient and faithful and all-sufficient. And that's pretty awesome.